When I left the radio on Friday, I was pointing out the United Nations Agenda 2030, which is a one world government movement to put the whole world under a global government in the name of trying to save the environment, to try to save the earth. The earth doesn't need to be saved, but the human family certainly needs to be saved from the United Nations. The text of the Agreement 2030 makes clear the nature of the scheme. Quote, this agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. It reads the preamble. All countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan, quote, unquote. The preamble also claims the UN goals will free the human race from the tyranny of poverty. The problem is everything they are promoting in Agenda 2030 or the Green New Deal will do nothing to alleviate poverty. It will do everything to plummet mankind and to plummet the human family into poverty. This agenda robs from men their ability to make a living, their ability to generate an income, their ability to become self-sufficient. Through nearly 80 years of the United Nations and all of their anti-poverty efforts, they have done little to reduce the area of poverty. The scheme also claims that it will heal the planet, quote unquote, or Mother Earth, as the UN agreement refers to it, not so subtly purporting to usurp the role of God. The United Nations even claim that the future of humanity and of our planet lies in our hands. Contrary to that is the clear teaching of the Scriptures that all things are upheld by the word of His power. It is not up to mankind to sustain the earth. God is sustaining the earth by the word of His power. This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance, boasts the document. Never before, quote, have world leaders pledged common action to and endeavor across such a broad and universal policy agenda. These specifics are even more troubling. In fact, as I documented last year during the month of February when we dealt with the religion of environmentalism, or the green religion, I pointed out that Agenda 2030 is essentially a roadmap to global totalitarianism, totalitarian rule over the human family. For instance, in Goal 4 of Agenda 2030, it demands the indoctrination of all children worldwide, with the kids described in the agreement as critical agents of change, quote unquote, who will rely on the Sustainable Development Goals to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. There we have another one of our buzzwords, and if I hear much more, I'm nauseated every time I hear it, and that is the word activism. The young people will become activists and will help to push this thing forward and push this thing through. Indeed, children worldwide must be so thoroughly indoctrinated that they will not just submit to the United Nations ideology known as sustainable development, there we are with our buzzwords again, but actually go out and promote it. By 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, quote unquote. Goal 4 explains, adding that children must also be indoctrinated in global citizenship and the UN's perverse view of human rights that is totally at odds with the God-given rights recognized by America's founders. The United Nations Agenda 2030 mandates national and international wealth redistribution as well. Goal 10 commits to reduce inequality within and among countries. Well, they will reduce the inequality not by making poor nations rich, but by making rich nations poor, so that the whole world is in poverty, miserable poverty, all together at the same time. That the agreement continues will only be possible if wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. Also, part of the plan is to ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, and there's more of that gobbledygook speak that I get weary of hearing, the vulnerable. And the poor and the vulnerable have equal rights to economic resources. Freedom and capitalism, liberty, is the greatest way of giving economic opportunity to people that don't have it. Agenda 2030 continues. This is, of course, the language used by the communists and socialists for more than a century, and now it is enshrined into the globalist dub international law, quote unquote. But even wealth redistribution is just the socialist start. The governments agree to take control over the means of production. We commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. Government-controlled universal health coverage, quote unquote. Vaccines for all are mandated. My worry is what is in these universal vaccines. Is there something in there to alter the brain waves in my brain to make me compliant, to take away my initiative and my drive, my independence, my will to live? Now, the feds are still implementing Agenda 2030 in the bureaucracy. That's the problem with the deep state. While many conservatives believed the election of Donald Trump meant the excesses of the Obama years were over, vast swaths of the federal bureaucracy are still implementing Agenda 2030 and the rest of the United Nations globalist agenda. In 2011 and then again in 2016, the Obama administration's Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, quietly signed a deal with the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, vowing to cooperate on everything from climate change education to imposing the United Nations Agenda 2030. The EPA UNEP agreement, which went almost entirely unnoticed until now, bypassed the normal constitutional legislative procedures and facilitates what one leading critic described as the globalization of the United States government. And so even while President Donald Trump has announced that America would withdraw from the United Nations Paris Agreement on global warming, the other United Nations schemes, federal bureaucrats, are still dutifully working to implement them all. The so-called Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, which was sent to the New American Magazine by a high-level source within the environmental movement, claims that the UNEP and the EPA share common goals and objectives, and that the EPA and the UN will consolidate, further develop, and intensify the cooperation and effectiveness of the two, achieving the common goals and objectives. Under the plan, the EPA purports to have the power to cooperate with other governments and international organizations to protect the environment globally. And among the goals outlined in the document, the joint EPA-UNEP scheme provides the framework via which the UN and the EPA can cooperate in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, including the Sustainable Development Goals, and through which they may intensify such cooperation. Under the agreement, the EPA and the UNEP agree to cooperate on the broad range of initiatives. Among the areas where the two vow to work together with governments around the world is the implementation of the UN environmental agreements, including the changing and enforcing of laws and regulations to meet United Nations demands. The scheme also calls for working together on education, including on climate change. No doubt, the signatories intended to promote the discredited UN-backed hypothesis, the human emissions of CO2, which account for but a fraction of 1% of all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, were driving catastrophic global warming. Indeed, among the action taken by the MOU is responding to climate change by cooperating on reducing energy use and emissions of CO2 as essential gas exhaled by humans that is known to many scientists as the gas of life. I'm going to stop here. I have read in a number of scientific journals that we are dangerously close to not having enough carbon in the atmosphere now, and that the vegetation is actually struggling. The vegetation is in a circumstance of difficulty because the air doesn't have enough carbon in it. The trees have to have carbon in order to live, and if the trees don't have carbon to live, then obviously the trees' photosynthesis can't take place, and the trees are not able to produce oxygen. Truly, we are in a very dangerous predicament because these people, in the name of saving the earth, could actually destroy the earth and do very significant damage and harm.
Post Office Box 4, Greenville, South Carolina 29602. This is Mark